Hi, I'm Mara Webster with In Creative Company, and today I'm so excited to be talking about the wonderful film Woman of the Hour with director and actor Anna Kendrick and screenwriter Ian McDonald. And Ian, starting with you, I love the journey of how you discovered this story, that you actually came across it on a true crime website. But the fact that it sounds like you were much more interested in the mechanisms around someone who was able to perpetrate these crimes and for it to continue going unchecked than him as an individual, himself and his specific story. And I was very interested in how that shaped the way that you approached writing the screenplay for this.
Yeah, well, I mean, there were sort of two reasons for that. Like, on one hand, I feel like psychopaths are these people that we assume to be oceans, like because they're so dark. But they're kind of emotional puddles. They don't actually go all that deep. They're people where, hurting other people makes them feel good and they scratch that itch. And which isn't to say they can't be complicated. Like I almost view Rodney Alcala's story as like an addiction narrative, where he's, towards the end of the movie when he has a crying moment, he doesn't feel bad for his victim, he feels bad for himself, and so all of which is to say, like, they're interesting, but there's kind of only so deep you can go with them. Conversely, like all the people who had the misfortune to encounter him, like I actually identify a lot more with those people. Cheryl in the movie is like, a struggling artist living in Los Angeles trying to make a life for herself, and like that's how I feel. And yeah, I don't know. I just found those characters so much more rich and interesting, and the goal for me was always to make sure that there was equity between how much we learn about Rodney and how much we learn about the people who he encountered.
Yeah. I love that answer. And kind of very similarly with you, Anna, it sounds like, again, it was less interest in getting to know the real Rodney and his backstory and what led him to perpetrating these behaviors, but more what is the experience that the women have on the other side, on the receiving end of this. And so, how did that start to shape the way that you were envisioning directing this film?
Yeah. Well, first I'll say that, I tend to agree with Ian, that psychopaths are not as interesting as we tend to believe them to be. And there was a certain point at which it felt more like we weren't like, once Danny came on board to play Rodney, we weren't really even sticking strictly to the idea of psychopathy, because just statistically speaking, we're pretty unlikely to encounter an honest to God psychopath. We are very likely to encounter people who are emotionally stunted and wounded and unable to hold empathy because of their own stuff that they're unwilling to hold, and instead they enact it on you. And that can sometimes look and feel like psychopathy, but probably isn't. So, there are certain things in the movie which do very much follow a kind of addiction narrative, or something more like narcissism, or something like that. And really just like a lack of emotional regulation ability. And the fact that, like, I don't know, I think in all likelihood, Rodney probably was a psychopath and a sexual sadist. I think that Ian and I talked a lot about how there is an emotional truth that we want to get at, and sometimes like sticking to precise factual accuracy actually gets in the way of that. So, we wanted those details to be in the film when they served the story and, brought out something emotionally interesting. But at any rate, I think that, to Ian's point, the idea that there's so much more richness and complexity in every other character is something that was really interesting to both of us. And even, I had this really insistent idea in my brain about keeping the women tied to the natural world. And there's a couple reasons that spoke to me, but I think one of them is we have a very limited window of time to really invest in and fall in love with some of these characters. And putting them in that setting felt right because it speaks to the vastness and complexity of their life beyond this moment. I don't know if that
Absolutely.
was an answer. Sorry.
No, it was a really, really wonderful answer with so much detail. It kind of also makes me think about one of the things that I appreciate so much in this movie and wanted to ask you both about was obviously you have this main storyline, which is Rodney and all of the crimes that he's perpetrating against women, but there's so much about the micro and the nuance in this film as well. There's like all these little microaggressions that male characters make towards women. There's the neighbor who stands too close, that walks into the apartment and sits down without being invited. There's the television show host who doesn't really look at Cheryl as a person when she's on the show. She's an entity. And so in writing the script and directing the film and telling the story, how did you both want to find those nuances as much as you wanted to tell that larger scope of the story?
Did you want to take that, or?
No, I was actually just I was what talking about the neighbor who stands too close in the hallway just makes me think of how exciting it was the day that Ian and I were working on the last scene that Cheryl has with her neighbor. And we were kind of dancing around, some dialogue between them, what they could say, and I just was smiling because I was remembering the moment that Ian was like, maybe they don't say anything and he just has to move around her. I think I like stood up and threw something across the room because I was so excited.
Yeah, no, I kind of think of a lot of those moments as being some of the most fruitful parts of our collaboration. I thought, Anna had this just a great bullshit detector in term as a filmmaker and a storyteller and a reader, where she would go through and be like, this feels 10% wrong to me. This is just a little bit off, and specifically with the issue of, giving some of the female characters like too much agency. That was a note she gave me early on. She's just like, I like that you're making them like tough and assertive, but like, and that sounds funny, and it kind of is, but there's like a really important truth there where she's just like, look, if I'm trapped in a car with a guy in the middle of nowhere, I'm not going to be saying like, whoa, dude, back off. Like, she's just like, she's going to be really polite and pleasant. She's not going to make waves because she has to be careful, And so even though I like the idea of the character that you're writing, the reality just feels wrong to me. It's not checking that emotional box. And so she was constantly grounding it in reality more and more and more, which, the moments you're alluding to, that's kind of what I think of. It's just like, how can we ground it just a little bit more? How can we make it, how can we do less in a weird way like that?
Kind of.
Yeah.
Yeah. But I mean, I was thinking about that because, we joke about the fact that I gave him this very strange note, which was, you keep giving the women too much agency. And I phrased it in that way because I think it's a very funny way to say that, because obviously it speaks so well of Ian as a human being and as a writer, that he wants his female characters to have agency. But, I think the other piece underneath that was I was really asking him, to trust me to get those intentions that he had on the page in the scenes through performance.
Mhm.
And that it would be clear to the viewer that that something has turned and that this woman is very uncomfortable and she wants to say something and she can't say something, like all in like 2 seconds in somebody's eyes. And so, it was kind of an act of trust to start asking him to pull back on some of that stuff.
Yeah, the kind of those conversations around the way that sometimes you placate someone when you feel unsafe because you don't know what the response might be if you bring it to the surface, kind of makes me think about something that I've heard you describe as well with this film, Anna, which is that, it's exploring a sense of shame as well, because there's also this cultural narrative around a lot of situations, which is, why did you get in a car? Why did you trust that person? And so how did you both want to look at, not just the way that women are trying to make the man feel safe and to make him feel comfortable and placate in a lot of situations, but also that idea of this underlying sense of shame of, am I the person that caused this situation?
Yeah, I mean, I'll say that that's a complicated theme in the movie, and it's not something that's like super explicitly stated, but I think that I was always a little worried about people watching the movie and being like, oh my God, just victim after victim. Like, why are you getting in the car with him? Why are you, charmed by him? Because the viewer has, the benefit of knowing what these women don't know. And something that made me really happy is that a couple of people have said to me early on when I was showing like early cuts of the movie that they found themselves during the dating game portion, like rooting for Rodney and then hating themselves for rooting for Rodney. That section of the screenplay was always so solid. And I feel like that section is like almost the most consistent over 2 years of drafts, because it was always just so solid. And it works so well in like kind of tricking the viewer into a position of going, yeah, he's great, she should pick him, and then having to grapple with the idea of like, oh, this is why the girls get in the car.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, also, this to me kind of goes back to what we were talking about a minute ago, with respect to like what we fictionalize and why we would fictionalize things, where, some of the dialogue in the dating game section was largely made up, for two reasons. One, the footage of the entire episode just doesn't exist anymore. So we had to a certain extent. But the other issue is that like dating norms and humor and a lot of stuff like that has just changed over the course of the last 50 years. And so if you go back and you watch Rodney's original episode, like just his clips, it's just like, oh, that dude's a serial killer. Like he's bad. Like he just exudes ickiness. But the problem is in 1978, like he was kind of funny and he was charming because he was playing by the rules of his time. And so like one of the things that I was always worried about is that if you just take his words and you put it in a modern day movie now, audiences are going to look at Cheryl and say like, how come you don't see that this guy is a creep, And so you're trying to do this thing where you're trying to like ground the story in the era in which it's set, and yet at the same time allow the audience to have the same emotional journey that Cheryl's having in the movie. And so so there was some updating that happened that, in terms of his language and his jokes and his delivery, that was meant to check similar emotional boxes that the real guy checked in 1968. He's funny, he's charming, he's whatever, while at the same time, kind of appealing to modern audiences a little bit, and I think that ties into that issue of shame. We don't want Cheryl to feel like, oh, how did you not see this coming? We want audiences to feel like, yeah, I could see myself being charmed by that guy too.
It's a great point. And one of the directing choices that I wanted to ask you about was the way that you've kind of used reflections to represent the way that women are looked at throughout the film, because you've really used mirrors or glass or monitors in the TV studio when there's moments where the women aren't being looked at and seen fully. And I was just very interested in how you came up with that specific creative choice, because I think it's wonderful.
Yeah, it's funny. It doesn't seem like the first spot that it would have occurred to me. But for some reason, the first time I thought about that was for the scene in the car with Laura and her boyfriend, when she's sort of telling him, I think I know that guy. I think that is a very dangerous person. And I always saw the boyfriend as like probably the nicest guy in the film on a sliding scale from like okay, decent to pretty monstrous, and to fully monstrous. And I liked the idea that like they genuinely are in love. For the times, he's what passed as a really good guy, and he does love her, and yet he is totally missing her. And I wanted like her to be inside of his shot, and kind of almost like we can't see her fully when we're on his face and he is just baffled by what's happening, that like we're still seeing her, and it's almost as though, oh, that's how he sees her in this moment. I don't know, it made sense in my head.
Could I actually add something to that? Because
By all means.
like seeing that on the big screen last night, I was able to appreciate it in a way that I hadn't been before. And it was interesting because the effect it had on me in the moment was that, like, so you have Laura and she's here and, you know, her boyfriend's in front of her. But when it's just a close up of her, you always see him reflected in the window over her shoulder. And so she's bookended by men. It feels like she's trapped, like she's physically trapped in the car, but there's a man behind her looking at the back of her head and a man in front of her looking at her face. And so it sort of heightens the claustrophobia. And yeah, I loved that. I thought that was incredible.
Yeah, I don't know. But it is funny, like that theme ended up becoming so much more, but that was like the first moment where I thought about using it. And then yeah, I thought about all these other ways that we could use camera lenses and mirrors and glass. And to the point where I was like, oh God, is this like getting heavy-handed? Is this like a self-serving, like, oh, I'm doing directing style choice? But I thought that it actually really informed some of the scenes and performances, you know, when Tony Hale, the game show host, like won't look at me. And I keep trying to get him to just look at me, and he's just totally engaged with my reflection because he does totally see me as like product or object in that scene. I thought that made the scene more interesting. And I guess, I don't know, I guess like I wanted to find a way to visually represent this idea in these moments where women are being looked at and not seen, without kind of defaulting to this like established visual language of, oh, when a woman's being objectified, the camera takes the perspective of the male, you know, subject and sees her as object and, you know, kind of fragments her body. Because if I do that, then sure, maybe I'm accomplishing the goal tonally, but am I not also then just contributing to more women actually being objectified on screen? Like, it's just a complicated kind of question to solve. And then, you know, being able to use camera lenses and reflections and stuff to get that idea across felt a lot more satisfying and in line with the goals of the movie.
Yeah. One of the things that I think in the script and in the filmmaking as well that's so impressive is the sense of tension that's constantly building, because there doesn't need to be something really dramatic happening on screen in order to feel it. You feel that physical sense of tenseness throughout, and the way that it kind of gradually builds the more time that we spend on screen with the story. And so I was very curious for both of you how you worked about setting that out, because I think it comes through in the script to begin with, and just the undercurrent of everything that's going on beneath the surface, and then in the filmmaking choices that you've made, and I think also very specifically in the editing as well.
Yeah, so I mean, one of the sort of tricky balancing acts with the movie for me was, you know, I think it's about thematically important material. I wanted it to feel emotional and substantive and, you know, kind of elegant, and yet at the same time, you know, there is this thriller aspect of it. You know, it's kind of the sugar that helps the medicine go down. And so you want to keep the audience engaged, you know, so that they can engage with the deeper themes of the material. And you know, in a way, it's very old fashioned. You know, it's the Hitchcock bomb under the table thing. You know, where you put the bomb under the table, people show up, they have a conversation, and then for the entire scene, you're just waiting for it to go off. You know, you have Rodney commit this awful crime in the first scene, and then everything that happens on the dating game, every scene after that, it's just the audience should feel this tension, because even when he doesn't do anything, we know what he's capable of. And so that can't help but load the movie with a kind of fraught anxiety. Yeah, and so I think it was a structural device in some ways that gave me access to those feelings.
And for you, Anna, in terms of building that through the filmmaking as well.
Yeah. Well, yeah, as Ian was talking, I was just thinking about, you know, because I think he sort of stopped himself because yes, like once Cheryl encounters Rodney on the dating game, obviously that tension is there, but there's even that tension with Cheryl and her neighbor. And I mean, even, well, even, you know, the shot where I wake up in bed with Terry, I was I mean, no spoilers, I hope, but I wanted that to kind of mirror this shot where a young woman wakes up and she's next to Rodney. We couldn't totally match the shot because I just physically couldn't hide Pete Holmes's body. He is a giant man. I think he's like 6'5". But yeah, you know, trying to keep that idea of, well, yeah, is this, you know, kind of harmless, annoying neighbor actually harmless? Like, who am I actually like waking up next to? You know, is it just kind of a pig that I happen to know, or is it someone very, very dangerous? And so, yeah, that question is like hanging over every interaction that Cheryl has, even before we know that she's going to meet Rodney.
Yeah. And I think also in some of those smaller scenes, it's like a lot of the tension comes from like the nuances of the conversation, not just how they're written, but how they're performed. Like to me, the most interesting thing in the world is when you're with a group of people and somebody tells like a 4 joke and somebody else laughs like an 8 laugh and everyone just goes like, ooh, what just happened there? That felt weird. You know, it's like where in the scenes you realize that there's kind of mixed expectations, you know, and even if people aren't saying them, they're kind of like hinting at them and you feel it in your bones. And uh you know, and audiences are smart, and so they're going to pick up on those little subtleties and realize like, oh, this is like they can feel it just kind of going awry. And in some ways, like those are the most uncomfortable things in the world, because like how many people have run into a serial killer? Not many. How many people have had to sit through like the world's worst wedding speech? All of us, you know, and like that stuff is just is its own kind of anxiety.
And one of the scenes that I also wanted to talk about a little bit was the sequence where Cheryl's walking through the parking lot with Rodney, and she at this point has realized, you know, something isn't quite right here, and I need to remove myself from the situation. And when she's walking to the car, there's all these amazing choices in the filmmaking. You know, you have the sound of the shoes and the sound of her breath suddenly like front and foremost. You can tell that there's nobody nearby because you use this technique that you use a few times in the film, which is pulling back to the wideness and just seeing that expansiveness of how far would you actually have to go to find someone to get any sense of help at this point. And even just the coldness of the breath that we see on screen as she starts to breathe more sharply. And so I wanted to ask about just building together all of those elements for that scene.
Well, I'm smiling that you mentioned the sound of the shoes because I started to refer to that scene with my cinematographer as the click clack scene, because it's like such a long way to go, and I could in that kind of cat people way, I could kind of hear the footsteps, you know, as we were putting the scene together. And then funny enough, I tried on my shoes and was like, oh, they're great click clack shoes. These shoes make a great sound. So free sound design, we love that. But yeah, that was one of the first scenes that I could really visualize. Like when this kind of bubbling thought of like, oh God, what if I pitched myself to direct the fucking movie? When that would come forward, that was one of the first scenes that I could really see in my head. And I knew that what felt right was to stay close to them in like mediums and close-ups. And then once it's very clear that there's some danger, to jump wide, because I think that's the internal experience, is that, you know, you're mostly just aware of like the 6 feet around you, let's say. And then the moment that you feel like, oh, something might be terribly wrong right now, you suddenly kind of become aware of, okay, what can I hear? Can I hear anything other than my own breath, than the buzzing of the street lamps? Can I see any peripheral movement anywhere, you know, as far as my eyes can even see? So wanting to have that really expansive exposure feeling, and waiting until something had turned to really show the audience how dark and different this parking lot is because the last time we saw it, it was bustling and busy and colorful. Because I think that's the lived experience, is that you wouldn't necessarily notice just how empty and dark a parking lot is until you thought, there's someone with me right now who is not a safe person.
Yeah. Ian, one of the things that also strikes me in the way that you've written Rodney as a character is, sometimes you see these types of characters and you see them very much as chameleons that kind of evolve into different versions of themselves for different people. But he's someone who very much has like a rhythm and a routine. And we very much see that he is hiding in plain sight. Once you kind of reflect on those moments, there's a lot of red flags and lots of clues. And he's only able to keep it underneath the surface for so long before it inevitably comes out in front of people. And so how did that shape the way that you wanted to write a lot of the scenes with him?
Oh, I mean that was entirely the reason I wanted to write the movie, So, in true crime circles, sometimes people will compare Rodney to like Ted Bundy. And what I think they mean by that is that like, he's handsome and he's kind of charming and well educated. But in some ways they were polar opposites. Ted Bundy was a chameleon. He made people like physically, he could weirdly make himself look very different. And he projected something that was very unlike his actual self. And Rodney tended to flaunt it. And to me, that's the thing that's interesting, because that when you learn that, you go like, oh, in some ways the movie really isn't about Rodney at all. It's about all the people around him and the larger sort of societal implications of people looking the other way and kind of and as a way of enabling bad behavior. And yeah, he kind of has a shtick, He tends to kind of lean on the same things over and over again, where he's just like, "Oh, you look like a movie star. Can I take your picture?" Da 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 da. And it kind of works up until it doesn't, Like he goes on a date with Cheryl, and he's just like, "Oh, you've got this Patti Smith thing," and it's just like, "Yeah, she's not buying it, dude." Like, And so it just stops working. And in that moment, and I love how both Anna and Daniel play the scene where he tries to compliment Cheryl, or not compliment her. It's not in earnest. He's trying to charm her by comparing her to Patti Smith, and she sort of laughs at him and says like, "You're joking, right?" And his feelings get hurt, and suddenly he's embarrassed, and the embarrassment turns to anger, and you just sort of see the situation curdle in front of your eyes, and it's just this lovely silent awkwardness and tension and danger and all and this is like maybe my favorite directorial choice in the movie. All the sound drops out and you're just left with like pure silence, and it's I mean, it's haunting. It's anyways, but sorry, I've sort of strayed from the question, forgive me. But yeah, yeah, he has a shtick, and that's also designed to make us go like, oh, maybe he's not so charming after all. He's just got a thing he does, it's less sincere.
And for both of you, in terms of the violence that we see on screen, I think this film does something really unique in that it creates a visual landscape that we see on screen, and at the same time, it allows the audience to use their imagination. Right from that very beginning scene in the movie where we see him attack someone, we see him place his hands on her, but we don't see the main act. We're obviously still watching the screen, but we know exactly how that scene is playing out in the moment. And I'm sure that it was incredibly intricate to both write and direct those scenes and those moments in the movie and figure out how do we, have a sensitivity and not glamorize these moments, but also be very truthful to what this is in the story and what was in fact reality in it. And so for both of you, I just wanted to ask a little bit about those scenarios and approaching those moments.
Yeah, I mean, I know that, I know that I can speak for Ian as well, that it was kind of a balancing act, because you don't want to kind of let the audience off the hook in a way. Uh, these things are awful and they should feel awful, yeah, there are certain movies that I think about where they were difficult to watch, but I was like, I'm glad I feel this upset, and I know neither of us are interested in graphic violence or gore or sensationalizing anything. And my pitch to, the producers was always like, well, I'm sort of borrowing the No Country for Old Men model of, you know, having a kind of shocking act up front and then being able to pull back more and more on what's explicit because we can use our imaginations. And I was very grateful that, you know, No Country for Old Men is a masterpiece, so that can't really be argued with. So it helped me win a couple of those battles. But I did actually shoot a couple, again, nothing graphic, but there were a couple more setups that would have just more explicitly just shown the action of the scene. And again, I think I thought, well, I have to put something on screen so that then I can actually do this thing of pulling back. And the scene worked fine. It was fine. It was good. It was fine. And but it just didn't really have a point of view, I guess. Like I don't know, something about it just didn't really work for me. And I just sort of remember like trying to think of how do I kind of, show it without showing it. And I asked my editor to go through some of the B-roll that we had shot that day before the actors came to set. And there was this shot that like panned across the valley. And I even remember, and we were just, I was just like, hey, there's so much beautiful stuff. Can we point some cameras at it? I remember even the focus puller being like, do you want me to roll focus on this? And I was like, hell yeah, I do. And more or less like lamenting the fact that there was nowhere for it in the movie. And then saying to my editor, hey, what if we took that shot, like this beautiful shot, and we were on that and we were just hearing what was happening, because our imaginations are always worse than anything I or anyone else could put on screen. And it also feels like, again, it's speaking to how full and rich and beautiful this life of this woman is and was, and that while something terrible is happening to her, keeping in mind her grace feels important.
And what were some of the intricacies for you, Ian, in terms of writing those moments in the screenplay?
I mean, honestly, it was all very similar. Anna put it really well. I mean, it's, there's different kinds of violence in movies. We're not making Evil Dead 2, where it's basically a big cartoon, and especially when it involves real people, there's serious moral stakes in terms of how you write and shoot and edit violence. And I think the more upsetting a movie is in that way, the higher your responsibility as storytellers to use the audience, what you've put them through, to say something meaningful, and yet at the same time that can also be exploited, and so you like Anna said, like it should feel upsetting. If people don't walk away feeling upset by it, then you risk whitewashing the actual events of the movie. And yet if you push it too far, it becomes gratuitous. And it feels like, you risk it feeling exploitative. And so it exists on a dial. And so there were various drafts of the script where it was a little more violent and a little less violent. And, I think we shared a common understanding about, why it was there and what emotional impact we were trying to hit. And that we aspired to a kind of ethical depiction. And at a certain point, you just kind of have to feel your way through it and see if you can sort of land someplace that feels right.
I appreciate hearing all of these details so much that went into the writing and the filmmaking and the performances. You've both done such incredible jobs with this movie, so thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.